we had two dads whose songs were very famous, but they weren't famous. Nobody knew who they were. And the bigger issue for us was that though they lived 7 blocks apart, I don't know anybody that has seen the movie would know this, they didn't socialize outside the office. So here they were, these two guys that had spent their lives writing songs about families coming together, and they couldn't ever, not once, spend the same time personally in the room with each other's family.
Except at the piano.
At the piano, they could spend time together because that was work. But
Yeah.
I love that you're doing the movie Mary Poppins, because of all the films that my dad and uncle worked on, and they did more song scores than any composers in history. There's nothing better than Mary Poppins. It was really this incredible film, and the clip you showed of the opening, and people were sort of deciding whether it was A, B, or C. Walt Disney spent the better part of 3 decades trying to secure the rights to this film. And every frame of footage tells story. So even if it doesn't seem necessarily as though it is doing something, it is putting a tone over the movie. It is introducing a character that didn't exist in any of the books, this character Bert that they just sort of invented, who would be sort of a jack of all trades kind of guy. And he's not necessarily introducing characters there, but he's giving you a tone that there's going to be something happening. Like I saw in the comments, somebody wrote something's coming.
Yeah, like in West End.
It's that same kind of thing where you were saying they go several minutes without actually lyrics, but they're giving you context. They're telling story. If you're going to, everything that I've seen that you're doing in your course is showing really the best of the best in terms of musicals. So they don't waste a lot of stage time or screen time in these good movies. Everything means something. So it was very important to sort of set the table for what's to come. And that's what that opening number does.
Terrific. Where do you come down? Because it could be A or it could be C based on what you just said. If you have to pick
I
one.
think C. It's a hybrid. It's sort of having fun. It's sort of introducing a character, but it's also giving you a sense of tone. It's giving you what's going to happen, that there's going to be some sort of lighter moments. There's also going to be a sort of heavier or more personal and passionate kind of context laid over that. And he asked them to do a couple songs for different movies of the week he was doing on his TV show. And he finally just said, and now I'd like you to read this book and tell me what you think. And they read Mary Poppins and underlined a few chapters. And the big problem for them was that there was no real reason for Mary Poppins to be with the children. There was no reason for her to come. There was no reason for her to leave. So they started thinking like storytellers, which is why Walt really trusted them. And they came up with this idea that would have a reason for her to be there to fix this broken family to the best that she could. And then she'd move on to the next place and work her magic on the next broken family. And Walt handed them a contract after they gave a few song sketches and sat there in a meeting with them. And they started working on this project for years, not knowing that Walt had still not secured the rights. And then all of a sudden, they were sprung on this idea. Walt said, "Yeah, Mrs. Travers is going to come into town, and I got to get out of here." So this whole notion of Saving Mr. Banks, where he takes her to Disneyland and does all this cajoling, he was nowhere to be found. He left them in a room with their visual story guy, Don DeGrati, and eventually they brought on their best screenwriter, the staff screenwriter, Bill Walsh. And it was the 4 of them plus Walt, who micromanaged everything, that came up with the character of Bert.
Yeah.
And that he would be this through line for Mary to bounce off of, and there would be no romantic interest. That was very important.
Right.
So that's
so in that clip, how old was your dad?
Oh, that was I should mention, that was on the Disney lot. That was about 2 years ago.
Okay. Well, he looks great.
Yeah.
He's engaging. How's he doing now?
Great.
Yeah.
You know, he's obviously slowing down a little bit in his. He's turning 93 in a couple months, and he is still, as long as we're talking subjects like music and fun stuff like that, he is the most engaging, fun, adorable person in the world. His short-term memories kind of.
Sure. Does he spend time at the piano?
Oh yes, absolutely.
Yeah. That must be a treat.
He's still working. I'm working with him. It's phenomenal. Yeah, it's fantastic. He's still getting assignments. So as long as there's assignments and they're hiring him, he's back at work.
Cool.
Yeah.
So I have to ask you before we go on, the number one question I get when I talk about Disney's Jews. I have a class I've offered twice on Disney's Jews. I'm offering it again in a program not part of this class, a program called Limud North America. I'm offering my Disney's Jews class again later this month. The number one question I get is, wasn't Walt anti-Semitic? Was he?
Absolutely not. But I will tell you, there is a kernel of truth behind everything. Okay. And I will tell you, he was not at all. He wasn't anti-anything. He was a lovely man who loved all people and hired all kinds of people and gave opportunities to minorities and women and everybody else, and never had anything against the Jewish people. Here is where that rumor happened. And the rumor mill, you know, there was no Twitter back then, but Walt was known to tip a few Scotch mists at the end of a day. And he had a chip on his shoulder from the time he was an early filmmaker till and Mary Poppins really changed all that for him. And let me just back up a little bit. There was a moment where Shirley Temple handed Walt a special Oscar. I don't know if you remember this, but it was a Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs Oscar, and it had all the dwarfs, right? Exactly. And Walt was very gracious about it, but it burned him up inside because he really saw himself on the same scale with MGM and Paramount and Universal. He wanted to be a major player, and he felt as though every guy that ran those studios, whether it was Louis B. Mayer or Sam Goldwyn, he was friendly with them, but that was their club, and he was not a member of that club. Just go off into Burbank, into the orange groves, and do your little cartoons. We don't want to be bothered with you. You're not a serious filmmaker. And it absolutely burned him up. So occasionally, in mixed company, he would refer to them as those Jews are keeping, and it was something like that. And if you say something like that in mixed company and it's taken out of context and the game of telephone goes on, it does end up becoming legend at that point. He was not he was very specifically talking about the guys that were keeping him from ascending to the area where he was going to be. And Mary Poppins, when it was released, was the biggest film that year. It got 13 Academy Award nominations, more than any Disney film before or since, and won 5 Academy Awards. And that now he was considered a filmmaker.
That put him on the map. That's really
that put him on the map. And nobody kind of, people my age, people on this chat probably don't think of Disney as anything other than this giant monolith that is swallowing everything whole and everything is owned by Disney. This was a little boutique studio that did a lot of failures, along with a lot of hits and misses. That it was not a super successful studio.
Yeah,
it was a little boutique studio, but Walt was this visionary, and my dad and uncle were the luckiest 2 songwriters in the history of cinema and everything else, because Walt had just opened Disneyland and there were no songs there. He had a weekly show and he needed songs for that. And he had his magnum opus, which was landing the rights to Mary Poppins, that he knew would be his entire bag of tricks as a producer.
So we should talk about the theme parks and some of these projects. They wrote quickly and they wrote lots. Yeah. So you heard what the homework assignment was, which was in general this concept of earworms. When I say earworms, people say it's a small world. That's the one that they always bring up. Yeah. Is that something they were insulted by, or was something they were proud of?
Yeah, insulted all the way to the bank.
Worthy. Tell me about it.
I'll tell you an interesting. This is the story of It's a Small World from the point of view of my family. This may not extend out to people that it was deliberately supposed to be that, but it didn't start out that way. Walt was building 2 pavilions for the World's Fair in 1964. And one of them was going to be where the audience rotated and the set piece would stay, and that was Great Big Beautiful Tomorrow. And they had written a song for that. And it was, they didn't understand what audio animatronics were. He brought my dad and uncle to play it for the people of WED so they understood how they were going to build it and how the sound was going to work. And this was just going to be a pavilion in the 1964 World's Fair, and this was 1963. And they're driving back, and my uncle's sitting in the front seat, and he says to Walt, you know, it's really great that we're getting this opportunity. We know it's going to the children. We'd like to donate the future proceeds of the song to UNICEF and Walt tears off the freeway, slams on his brakes, and he says, that song is going to put your great-grandchildren through college. You never give up the rights to that song. And got like angry, and then like pulled back on the road and just kept driving down. He had visions. They didn't know. They thought it was going to be, you know, there for the time of the World's Fair and it was going to go away.
Oh.
He knew what he was going to do. He knew he was building parks all over the world. He knew that that was all going to happen. They had no idea. And thank God he did that, because my kids are benefiting from his sage advice.
Oh, that's nice. That's nice. So we'll come back at the end. We'll let students have questions for you. Before we do, on a personal note, you did hear that I won Ben Stein's money.
That's fantastic.
Isn't that?
I probably wrote the questions that got you there.
We'll have to talk about that sometime. I had the best time. I think people on Jeopardy are like jealous and mean, but people on Win Ben Stein's Money had a great time. It was a wonderful show. So,
well, thank you.
Sure.
We had a fun time screwing with Ben, because we knew where his pockets of information were, and we knew how to write around them and get him crazed.
So yeah, you and I have to talk about that sometime.
Sure.
What I want to do now, I'm going to go back to the chat, is my question is, who is the main character in, just type it in, who's the main character in Mary Poppins?
That's a great question.
Main character, just go ahead and type into the chat, everybody. Who is the main character? Mary Poppins. Mary Poppins. Yeah, some of you have it. A lot of you have it. Okay. So all kinds of answers, great answers, but the answer is Mr. Banks, in my opinion.
Because he's the arc. He's the one who changes the most.
Exactly. So the most common way of defining a main character, a protagonist or a main character, is who's the one that changes, right? Which raises some really interesting questions. I think I've asked when I've taught Cabaret in this room, who's the main character of Cabaret? And that's a really hard question, because there are a lot of characters who don't change, right? So looking at this show, it's about how Mr. Banks gets from one attitude towards his kids to a new one, and people really miss that. And they think about, oh, Mary Poppins has to be the main character, and that's not the case.
Greg, growing up in this household with this music and all of these things going on.
Good question, Greg. Good question, Greg.
Well, like everyone, we had 5 pianos, and no, it was a really interesting thing, because my dad, we were walking, I think about a week or 2 ago, and he was holding on to me, and he's like, you know, the thing that mattered more to me than anything was writing good songs. I just wanted to be a great songwriter. That's all that mattered to me. And it was so true growing up, in answer to your question, in that we'd be having a family dinner, we'd be talking about whatever, you know, idiotic things had happened that day. And I have a younger sister, and he would just float away from the table and get to the quickest piano he could, because he was always working and he was always writing. And so he would just leave and just,
you know, Greg, you didn't really answer head on. You gave us an answer, but then you didn't explain it to this. You said he hated the idea that, oh, he writes earworms. He hated that. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that, I didn't answer it right on. I think that there's an art to writing earworms. And I feel like that if you have a melody that's sticky and that can resonate with you, I mean, in answer to Stu Lewis's question from a moment ago, I didn't feel like that really happened in the sequel to Mary Poppins, but there are so many sticky, memorable melodies in just one score of Mary Poppins that I just consider it a high praise.
Yeah,
And I don't consider it an insult at all. I think there are a lot of people that get upset because they can't get the song out of their heads for
yeah,
It's a Small World, but I'll take it. I think
yeah.
that's a
But
high
your
praise.
dad was less comfortable with that. Your dad did not find it high praise.
No, he feels it's fine if people don't like it because he felt like he was on an assignment and he completed the assignment
I
and
see.
he gets as much many people say it's their favorite ride on the park as he does people that are just detractors. He
Right.
tends to like the people that like it more.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a secret song that I use when I'm stuck on an earworm that erases it. And I have a superstition that if I ever tell anybody, it won't work. So, but it does
Keep it to
work.
yourself.
It
Okay.
does work.
I don't know if it was Leonard Bernstein that he would have. He wanted to be Cole Porter. He wanted to write also the
Right.
Great American Symphony, and he had the chops for it. It's just, as I was saying earlier, my dad and uncle got the greatest opportunity of any songwriters to not only write for the greatest entrepreneur of the 20th century, arguably of all time, but that platform of writing on for Disney and being in the parks and being in his movies would make these songs last for generations. I think he'll take that. And yes, to
Mhm.
your point, there are times where I feel like some of the lesser known works of theirs are just incredible and they do get a little bit more adult. But they didn't have the same opportunity as a movie that came out with the Disney label.
My
Is that
favorite
mine?
My
Excuse me.
favorite Sherman Brothers tune is One Little Spark. That's the one that
That's
from
lovely for
Administration.
Epcot.
I
Yeah,
love that
sure.
tune. So
They wanted to do a stage musical, but Pamela Travers, who was still alive at the time, was adamantly against it because she hated the movie so much that she bought a new dress for the premiere in Toronto, and then she bought a new dress for the premiere in New York, and she hated it all the way to the bank, and ended up future books had one chapter was entitled Supercalifragilistic. So she really leaned into her hate of that, but she did despise what Walt had done to her books. And
okay.
going back to what one of your people had asked me earlier, what my dad had said to her at the time back in 1961 is like, look, Walt is going to do his version of these things, but that doesn't change your books. Your
Yeah.
books will always be your books.
Yeah.
And same with the stage musical and same with the sequel, that doesn't change the original movie. So what Cameron McIntosh, one of the giant, I'm sure you know, impresarios in theater, did was he went to Pamela Travers on her deathbed and said,
Oh,
I really want to do a stage musical of Mary Poppins. And she said, well, I will give it to you because I trust you. And David, you can rattle off Miss Saigon and Les
sure.
Mis. He's the impresario of theater. And um, she entrusted him with this
Yeah.
under the condition that every single person working on it had to be British. So if there was going to be new songs,
Okay.
and she's Australian, which makes it even more
Yeah.
kind of quirky, which she was. That's probably the nicest
Isn't
thing
it
I can
ironic
say.
that much of it is red?
So it was one of the original song sketches that they came in with after Walt had given them the books, and they came back with this storyline, and they had written out song sketches are like 8 bars of a number, 16 bars. They hadn't written the complete song. And at the time, this was called Tuppence a Bag, and it was just something that uh, talked about charity. And it was a little chapter about the bird lady in the books that they thought was a metaphor for the entire film. It doesn't take much to it tuppence, 2 pence, 2 pennies to give a little bit back to the those that are in need. And that's the lesson for the entire Banks family, for Mr. Banks, for everybody. And so they played this, and Walt just, he got it. And he's like, that's what it's all about in 1961 when they played it for him. And he just went to the east window of his office and said, "Play me that Bird Lady song again." And my dad played, because my dad was a pianist, and he played it again. And Walt said, "I got some contracts sitting on my desk. I'd like you guys to come work here." And they are the only ever staff songwriters that have ever worked for the Walt Disney Company. And every Friday from that point until his death, he would call them into his office and he'd ask them what was going on, what assignments they were working on. And then he'd look to my dad and go, "Play it." My cousin Jeff, my co-director and co-producer on the documentary that we did about our dads, was a little boy, about 5, and he had come home. Julie Andrews, who my dad and uncle had seen on a clip on the Ed Sullivan Show, she had come on and sung a song from Camelot. And they both called each other and said, "We're watching Mary Poppins. This has got to be our Mary Poppins." So they wanted to storm into the office the next day and tell Walt, "We found the Mary Poppins." And his secretary smartly stopped them and said, "You know what? If you tell Walt you saw the Mary Poppins, he's not going to do that. I'm going to get him tickets. He's going to be in New York. He's going to see for himself." And so Julie Andrews, of course, was pregnant at the time, and Walt said, "We'll wait for you to have the baby, and then you come out and you be our Mary Poppins." And when she first came out and heard all the songs, they had written this beautiful ballad about Through the Eyes of Love, a song you've never heard of because it was cut from the movie. Because Julie said, "That doesn't feel like Mary Poppins. I want something with more snap." And so concurrently, my uncle went home. He was very depressed. And my cousin comes home from school that day, and my uncle, who's never there at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, was sitting in a dark room. And he said, "How was your day?" He said, "Well, I got a shot. I got the polio vaccine." He said, "You let someone give you a shot?" He said, "No, I just, put the sugar on a cube and I swallowed it." And my uncle calls up my dad and says, "A spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down." I'm like, "That's a terrible idea. It helps the medicine go down." And then they went back to work. They went back to the office, and magic was born. And that's how
I just think it's so interesting that you can hate somebody. Maybe that's too strong, but you can hate somebody and do wonderful, wonderful work with them. That's so interesting to me.
Well, I don't think they hated each other.
Okay.
I think that they, deep down, they loved each other. They just didn't like each other very much. And it was their differences, that contention, that friction, that coming from a stereotypic point of view, that gave their songs a little bit more than just earworm quality, that made them durable, that made them last. I mean, Barney has earworm songs, but they're not lasting the test of time. There's something about...
Great question. Great. You raised a great point. In 200 years, which Sherman Brothers songs are we still going to be singing?
I think songs from Mary Poppins, I think songs from Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, songs from Winnie the Pooh, songs from Jungle Book. The difference between Mary Poppins and maybe some of their lesser works is not because the songs are any less good. It's that they didn't have the platform and the movie wasn't as good.
And there will be Disney parks in about 150 cities in the world, and they'll all have an It's a Small World.
I just want to say I've been on the ride at Disney, both Disneyland and Disney in Florida, and at the World's Fair. It's one of my favorite songs.
Thank you. My oldest son is in the music business. He's a rapper because, sure. And he's very talented, but the music business has so substantially changed that it is, I would say that, on some level, there's ways to market yourself that were never available before, all these different platforms, as David does with his YouTube channel and his classes. And there's a way to be self-promoted. But there are no record labels that are going to send you out on tour anymore. I mean, the music business is in the process of metamorphosizing. If that's not a word, it's a Sherman word. And so therefore, I think you just need to be conscious of what kind of songs you want to do, how you get your songs out there, if it's songwriting that you want to do, and finding great people to associate yourself with, which is the hardest part, because no one does it alone. You have to have...
When I was first sharing with people that you both were coming, I went back and forth between calling you guys the Sherman cousins and the Sherman sons. There's the Sherman brothers, and then which do you like better, the Sherman cousins or the Sherman sons?
I think Sherman cousins, because we both have 2 boys. So we both have our own set of Sherman brothers.
Nice. Oh, I see. Very
I've
nice.
spoken to Jeff about this a lot. And I want to know about the counterpoint between your uncle and your dad, because I know the experience your uncle had at the end of World War II. And I know that your dad didn't serve in the same
Oh, he
way.
did.
In
Not
the same way. In the same way. And I wonder if there's if that's what brought part of the conflict, and if that's what brought real depth
Now,
to the
you have to start by
songwriting.
telling us about your uncle at the end of World
Yeah,
War.
I
Why don't
will.
you do that?
I will. And I think that, I think that my uncle always had a kind of haunted quality, and he happened to be 17 when the Pearl Harbor, and he wanted to enlist immediately and got a special dispensation to enlist early. So he was an extremely young private in the Army and saw some fairly horrific things, and was one of the first soldiers to liberate the Dachau
Wow.
and was shot about a week or two later in the knee, and was haunted for the rest of his life from the experiences of World War II. But I feel like he had a predisposition to have that kind of seek that out.